Hello, my name is Daniel Bodkin. I'm a physical therapist and athletic trainer. And today I want to go over an ACL case study of an athlete that I worked with a few years ago. Here's our athlete. At the time, he was a 17-year-old American football player. After getting tackled on a punt return, he had to undergo surgery for his ACL, in which they use his patellar tendon as graft. They also had to repair his MCL, as well as repair his medial and lateral meniscus. For this first isometric test that I'm going to present to you, he was 12 weeks post-op, and at the time, his manual muscle test was 4 plus out of 5 for both the quadriceps and hamstring. And his range of motion was already full. He was going from 2 degrees of hyperextension through 130 degrees of flexion. Leading up to this test, we've been working on a standard ACL rehab, including all the range of motion, neuromuscular reeducation, and close kinetic and isolation exercises. On top of that, we have also been working on the machine. And when we're working on the isokinetic machine, we are focusing initially on isometrics. So just making that quadricep activate and generate torque. And then we started working on some dynamic isometrics in which this machine will give them a visual feedback and they have to generate torque to match that feedback. And that's really good for neurologic reeducation. We also started moving into the isokinetic mode in which we focus on eccentric control and loading. So for this, the machine will lift his limb up to the top, and once he's there, he'll activate his quadricep. And we're working on just light torque generation as the machine is bending his knee. So we're really working on getting those neurologic control and re-education, moving from that isometric mode toward a more dynamic control with motion. So here's his isometric test report that we performed at 12 weeks post-op. Looking at the graph itself, the top half of the report will be for the quadriceps and the bottom half is for the hamstring. If you look at the graph within each, the red line will be the left leg, the blue line will be the right leg, and the right leg is the involved leg. If we look at the quadriceps graph, you can see a pretty big deficit just looking visually at the graph itself. But if we look at the numbers, his quadricep, he had a bilateral deficit of 59%, which we would expect this early on after surgery. If we look at his body weight metrics, his involved quad was able to generate 28% of his body weight, and the uninvolved is able to generate 69% of his body weight. And ideally, we're looking for 100% here when he's fully returned. If we go now to the hamstring, looking at the graph, you can also see a pretty big visual deficit just in the tracing. If we look at the bilateral deficit, he's at a 65% deficiency, right to left. If we look at his body weight, his involved leg hit 12% of the body weight, and the uninvolved hit 33%. The ideal is 60% here. So even his uninvolved limb is only about half of what we would want it to be when he's at return to sports. Looking at his hamstring to quad ratio, his involved limb is at 0.4 and the uninvolved is 0.57. We want this to be between 0.6 to 0.7. And now we're jumping to 16 weeks post-op with this isokinetic test. Now, over the last month, we've been progressing his standard rehab with all of his close kinetic exercises, balance, and proprioception. And on the machine, we've been progressing his eccentric control, moving his speed starting very slowly at 5 degrees per second, all the way up through about 40 degrees per second. And again, focusing mainly on eccentric, but now we start introducing the eccentric and concentric for both muscle groups. So we'll work the quadriceps, concentric and eccentric, and then move into the hamstring, concentric and eccentric. We also started working on some isotonic exercise. And we use that mainly at this stage to enhance the muscular endurance as well as the neurologic control. Moving on to the isokinetic test at week 16. The first thing I want to point out that this is a concentric eccentric test. The standard isokinetic test, the patient pushes up on the way up with the quad and then pulls down on the way down with the hamstring. And it never assesses the eccentric function. But that's how our muscles, especially the quadricep, are going to function, and that's how they need to be rehabbed and tested. So the concentric eccentric test is a much more advanced way to test isokinetically. So this report here is only for the quads on this one report. If we look at the graph on the left, that's going to be his concentric quadricep. The graph on the right is the eccentric quadricep. The left leg is red, the right leg is blue, and again, the right leg is the involved leg. Looking at the graph, we can visually see right away that he has a pretty big strength deficit, which we would expect at 4 months post-op. Looking at the numbers themselves for the quadricep concentrically, he has a bilateral deficit of 52%. And I'm getting that from the work per repetition because that analyzes the strength over the entire range of motion versus just peak torque. Next, going on to the body weight metrics, and here I go to the peak torque because we have normative data for the lower extremities for body weight norms. His quadricep on the involved side hit 36%. The uninvolved is at 79%, and we want that to be 100%. So we can see that he's making a big improvement from that 3-month isometric test that he did before. But he still has a good way to go. He's about a third to a quarter of the way there for his involved side. And his uninvolved side is about 20% off of the ideal. If you look at the eccentric, we have a bilateral deficit of 45%. And if we look at the body weight metrics for eccentric, his involved quad hit 50%, his uninvolved hit 92%, and the ideal for eccentric is 130% of the body weight. Since the concentric quadricep should be 100% of the body weight, and research tells us that eccentric should be 30% stronger than concentric, that's how we get the 130% ideal for the eccentric. So again, he has a pretty big deficit of that involved side and a little deficit for the uninvolved. We also have a good measurement of power at this point. If we look at his concentric power deficit, he's 52% deficient, and his eccentric, which is the most important because that's what you're going to use when you land from a jump or make a change of direction, he's at a 48% deficit there. And that's reading his average power in watts. Next up is the hamstrings, and it's the same on the left graph. That's the concentric hamstring. On the right is the eccentric hamstring. And you can see a pretty big visual deficit in both modes there. For the concentric, we have a bilateral deficit of 44%. And if we look at the body weight metrics, his involved hamstring hit 30% of the body weight, and the uninvolved is at 57%. Normative data tells us that the hamstring should be 60% of the body weight. So his uninvolved hamstring is essentially at that minimum strength value already, and his involved hamstring is about half of where it should be. Looking now to the eccentric, on the numbers, you can see he has a bilateral deficit of 43%. And his body weight numbers, his involved hamstring hit 41%, the uninvolved hit 70%, and the ideal here is 80%. So eccentrically, he's a little bit shy of that minimum strength standard, and the involved side is, again, about half of where it should be. Looking at the power of the hamstring, he has a 44% concentric deficit and a 43% eccentric deficit. And we can also look at the hamstring to quadriceps ratio. Now, there's many ways that you can look at this. I'm just going from the concentric hamstring compared to the concentric quadricep, which is the standard ratio. His involved limb is at 0.89. His uninvolved is 0.76. And we want this to be between 0.6 and 0.7. So essentially at this point, his hamstrings are stronger than his quads. So we actually want to see that ratio go down a little bit as he progresses. For this next report, we're going to time travel about 2 months into the future. Our patient is now 6 months post-op. In the clinic over the last few months, we've been progressing from a rehab based exercise program into a strength and hypertrophy type program. We've also been introducing plyometrics, agilities, some sport-specific activity. On the machine, we've been progressing his concentric, eccentric speeds for both muscle groups, as well as the total volume and total time under tension. We've also started working on some rate of force development with our isotonic mode as well. Looking at the test report itself, we can see the quadriceps here. Again, the left side of the graph is the concentric quadricep. The right graph is the eccentric quadriceps. And you can look at the graphs and see the visual difference. We're making up some of that space there. The left is red, the right is blue in both of those. Still has a pretty big deficit visually, but if we look at the numbers, we can now see that his bilateral deficit has shrunk to only 26% concentrically. And if we look at the body weight metrics, he's now at 60% of his body weight for his concentric quadricep, and his uninvolved is at 93%. So he's making big improvements in both legs for the quadriceps. And again, the ideal here is 100%. So that uninvolved limb is just shy of where it should be, and his involved limb is 60% of what we would want it to be. Moving on to the eccentric, his bilateral deficit here is 31%. Looking at the body weight metrics, his involved quad is at 71% of his body weight, and the uninvolved is 116%. The ideal for the eccentric quadricep, again, is 130%. So in both the concentric and eccentric for his body weight metric, he's just over about halfway from where we would want him to be at 6 months post-op. His power deficit, concentrically, he is now only at a 26% deficiency in that rate of force development, and eccentrically, he's at 34%. Next up is the isokinetic test for the hamstring at 6 months post-op. Again, the left graph is the concentric hamstring. The graph on the right is the eccentric hamstring. We can see that that deficit that he had visually in the graphs is again starting to shrink. Looking at the numbers, his hamstring concentrically, we have a bilateral deficit now of only 21%. The body weight numbers, his involved hamstring is at 51% of the body weight, and the uninvolved is at 65%. And again, the ideal here that we're looking for is 60%. So his uninvolved hamstring is where we want it to be, and the involved hamstring is getting pretty close. Eccentrically, if we have a bilateral deficit of 27%, and looking at that body weight numerative data, the involved hamstring is at 81% of the body weight, the uninvolved is at 85%, and the ideal here, again, is about 80%. So his hamstrings now are getting much closer to those normative numbers, whereas his quadricep is still a little bit behind. Looking at the power deficit, on the concentric side, he's at 21% less power, and eccentrically, he's 28% less power. We look at the hamstring to quadricep ratio, again, just the concentric hamstring compared to the concentric quadricep. His involved side is at 0.82, his uninvolved is 0.76. So we're seeing this ratio start to drop down where we would expect it to be, closer to the 0.6 to 0.7. And that's because even though his hamstring is where it should be compared to his normative numbers, that quadricep is starting to catch up. So now we're going to jump to the 9-month post-op isokinetic test. And over this time, the patient transitioned away from the PT clinic and he started working with his high school football team strength coach. He was performing an independent gym program, and he would check in at the clinic every once in a while to make sure he was still on track. So this is his 9-month post-op test, and we can look at his quadriceps here. If we look at the graph on the left for his concentric quadricep, you can see that with the exception of the deep flexion, he's actually right in line with his uninvolved leg, but he still has a deficit in that 90 degree to about 70, 60 degree range. Eccentrically, we look at the graph and you can see he's pretty lined up with the exception of that deep flexion, again, about the 70 to 90 degree range. If we look at the numbers, the concentric quadricep, the bilateral deficit now is 17%. And again, this is work per repetition, not peak torque, because I'm looking at the entire range of motion, not just that one point. So he's at a 17% bilateral deficit for his strength. If you look at the body weight numbers, his involved concentric quadricep hit 90% of his body weight, and the uninvolved is 113%. What we're looking for here is 100%. So he's over what he needs to be for the uninvolved side and just under what he needs to be for the involved side. Eccentrically, we now have a bilateral deficit of only 5% when we look at the work per repetition. For the body weight normative data from peak torque, his involved side hit 115%. His uninvolved hit 137%, and the ideal here is 130%. So just like the concentric, his uninvolved side is above what we would need it to be, and the uninvolved side is just below. Looking at his power deficit, concentrically, he has 16% less power, and eccentrically, he only has 4% less power. Going now to the hamstring test at 9 months post-op. We look at the graphs. Again, you can see a small deficit in the bilateral. For both the concentric and eccentric. If we look at the numbers concentrically, he has a bilateral deficit of 18%. So he's getting a smaller deficit each time. And if we look at the body weight numbers, his involved hamstring is now hitting 57% and his uninvolved is 62%. And again, the ideal here is 60%. So he's right where he should be with both legs there. Eccentrically, he now has a bilateral deficit of 22%. Looking at his body weight numbers, his involved side hit 95% of his body weight, and the uninvolved is 105%. And again, we're looking for about 80% here. So he has a good eccentric strength in both legs, well above where he needs to be. If we look at the power, concentrically, he has a 19% deficit in his power, and eccentrically, he has a 22% deficit. If we look now at the hamstring to quadricep ratio, his involved side is at 0.58, his uninvolved is 0.59. So it's just below the 0.6. That's okay. We've been seeing that number going down with each test as his quadricep strength is catching up to his hamstrings. So now I want to show you what the progress report would look like. And in this, we now have 4 graphs. If we look at the top 2 graphs, that's for the right leg, the concentric on left, the eccentric on right. And the bottom 2 graphs is for the left leg, concentric on left, eccentric for right. And with the lines within each, what they are now is the blue line would be your first test that you put in, and the red line is the second. So what we're looking at now is month 8 versus month 9 for his quadriceps. Visually, you can look at those top 2 graphs. That's his right quadricep, month 8 versus month 9, and his eccentric quadricep, month 8 versus month 9. The bottom 2 would be for that uninvolved leg, the month 8 versus month 9. If we look at the numbers, what it gives us now is the value that they achieved in the first test, month 8, and then the value in the test, month 9, and then the percentage of improvement or regression. So the numbers that show us that for his concentric quadricep, his involved quad in that 1 month, month 8 to month 9, improved by 46%, and his uninvolved improved by an additional 20%. So he gained strength in both legs in that final month, but you can see he's gaining more strength in that involved limb. Eccentrically, we can see that his involved quad picked up 72% strength in that final month for this test, but the uninvolved only picked up 17%. And you can visually see that there too. If you look at that top right graph, you can see a big difference between the blue line, which is month 8, and the red line, which is month 9. So I like using the progress report to compare, the month-to-month tests. This is really good because it can show you where he's picking up strength, not just in which muscle group, the quad or the hamstring, but you can see it in the uninvolved and the involved leg as well. So I really like using the progress reports. And here we have the progress report for the hamstring, the same time period, month 8 versus month 9. You can see there's a smaller strength gained between the first test and the second test in both legs. Looking at the numbers, the hamstring for concentrically, his involved leg only gained 1%, and the uninvolved actually got 9% weaker over that last month. Eccentrically, his involved hamstring picked up 10%, and the uninvolved actually lost 7% strength on the test. So you can see in month 8 to 9, those big strength gains that he made were all coming from his quadricep, whereas hamstring essentially stayed the same. So this is why I love using the progress reports, because as your patient is making these functional improvements and improvements overall globally, you can isolate and see exactly where they're making those improvements. I've had some patients where the month to month the quadricep didn't gain any strength, but functionally they've progressed in the clinic. And because when we look at this, you can see all the strength might come from their posterior chain. So that gives you an idea of where they're gaining, but where you should really be focusing your rehab on or your next steps. And you can't get that unless you test and then compare. And then finally, I just want to tell you how the patient ended up doing. So at this point, at month 9, it was still a little bit before the start of the football season. And so he started working in practices with the team. When the season itself started, he didn't play any in the first game. And then the first 2 or 3 games after that, he started to play on special teams, started getting some reps in as a linebacker on the team. And they actually ended up switching him from linebacker to defensive line just because he was still a little bit slow on drop back and getting to some of his coverage. So he actually went to the defensive line, I think, as a defensive end. He did really well for the season, played really well, had a very good, successful, and safe return to play. If you enjoyed this case study and want more content just like it, please check out our full CEU course, Isokinetics 101 Online, approved for 8 credit hours for athletic trainers and physical therapists. Available online at humacnorm.com/courses/isokinetics.